There are no trash cans in Tokyo. I kid you not, this is absolutely true. Friends of mine who I've said this to and didn't believe me went to Japan later and confirmed that yes, there are indeed no trash cans in Tokyo. What is surprising is that Tokyo is probably one of the cleanest cities you'll ever see. So it boggles the mind as to how there are no trash cans there. Well, it's possible that Tokyo residents don't carry trash in public and therefore they don't need trash cans. And there's some merit to this theory, because in a survey that I heard about much later though, when asked about the most embarrassing moments of their lives, of their entire lives, the most embarrassing moment in their entire lives, the Japanese rated being seen eating in public as high as second. So, for example, although you have a huge American invasion, a cultural invasion of fast food restaurants and vending machines all over Japan, what you don't see, unlike in America, what you don't see in Japan are, Japanese walking around with a burger or a cup of noodles or a bento box on the street eating it. If the Japanese, if they go to a vending machine and they buy something there, they eat it right there quietly without anyone watching, trash it, and then they leave. Now, I didn't know this then. And I only noticed the absence of trash cans on my 5th day in Tokyo. We were there on a week-long trip. There were 3 of us representing an American bank on a trip to Japan. There was Doug Johnston, our leader. He was 40 years old, serious, bespectacled gentleman. There was Kevin Duffy, who was around my age at the time, mid-20s at the time. Though unlike me, he was a tall, strapping ex-Marine. And then there was me, who had moved from India 3 years prior to that to America and had just about gotten used to the culture there. And here I was representing an American bank in Japan. It was a tough trip. I don't know how many of you have been to Japan or seen the movie Lost in Translation. But you know those scenes where he's lying in bed all night staring at the ceiling because of jet lag? We had that every night. And it wasn't as if the days were easy. I mean, every day they took us for one head-nodding meeting after the other through these very respectable glass offices in Akasaka. And then there was the hospitality. So every night they took us out for an exotic meal, which sometimes can get quite hard. And after that came the clubbing, where we'd be taken out to Roppongi's, neon alleys and nasty bars with semi-clad waitresses and very, very, very shrill music. It was all very, very exhausting. In fact, Doug even asked the head of our local office, do we have to do all this? Is it so rude to say no to some of the hospitality? And the answer was yes. No one says no in Japan. So here we were on day 5 of this trip, exhausted by jet lag, hospitality, and an adherence to Japanese protocol. It so happened that on day 4, Kevin and I got particularly drunk, so I didn't spend that night staring at the ceiling. I spent it staring down the toilet bowl instead. And it turned out that on that Friday morning, Kevin and I walked into the office quite late and clutching our heads, literally clutching our heads in anguish. And there was Kawauchi, who was our bank's local employee, who was the one who was taking us around everywhere for all our meetings during the day and while we went out every night. And he was with us till late the previous night. But here he was, his light grey suit neatly pressed, his thick hair perfectly gelled, his black rimmed glasses askew by the same angle it was every day. He had a wad of papers in his right hand and he was not looking happy. But in his polite Japanese way, he said, very late, very late. And he just marched past us and led us towards our first meeting for the day. That first meeting was about 40 minutes by the clock, but it felt like about 2 hours to me. I didn't say a word. Even Kevin was silent throughout. Doug gallantly filled in and he, covered for us the entire meeting. And I looked at Kevin and he was in as much pain as I was. And this is an ex-Marine. So imagine my plight. Having woken up late and rushed out that morning without breakfast, my body was craving food and water. And despite the air conditioning being on, I felt the August heat even more so that day than any other day. So I even took my jacket off in the meeting at one point, but it didn't really help much. And as soon as the meeting ended, I rushed out of the room to try and get to a candy bar vending machine or a water fountain to get something into my system. But Kawauchi was very quick to rush us off to a cab to our next meeting immediately. And once we were in the cab, he sat in the front seat as was customary, and he turned around to give us feedback as he always did. And he turned to Doug and he said, "Johnston-san, good job." And then he looked at me. So I thought he was going to make fun of the fact that I was looking like hell or something of that sort. But all he said was, "Chadda-san, no taking off jacket in business meeting. Against Japanese culture." So I was about to say something, but he added on. And also, we leave meeting room in order of seniority. First Johnston-san, then Duffy-san, then you, then me. What you did, not good. So great, I was already pulling the team down. I mean, me, the little Indian in the group, was bringing down an entire American team in Japan. We had a break after our second meeting, so we headed back to our own offices, which was a big relief for Kevin and I, because on the ground floor of the building which housed our offices, there were a row of takeout restaurants, and Kevin and I really needed to eat some food. So we told the others that we're going to wait here, we're going to eat something. You all carry on upstairs, and when you all are heading for your next meeting, then you pick us up from here. And suddenly, from starving food and water to have a choice of 9 or 10 eating joints, it was overwhelming. And sometimes in moments like this, native instincts take over. So Kevin went straight for the McDonald's. Of course, I couldn't find an Indian restaurant, but I saw a Japanese teriyaki joint that had chicken curry rice. And I said, this is what I need to get. There was a long line there, but I figured this is what I really needed. So I stood in line for a while, and after 20 minutes, I got this white styrofoam container that had hot steaming rice and red chicken curry. And they just smelled phenomenal. So I took it and I sat down on a bench next to Kevin, and I started to eat this. Kevin had already chomped down 3 Big Macs, and he was looking quite satisfied. I had barely taken 2 bites of this when from the corner of my eye, I saw Doug and Kawauchi, who had a wad of papers in his right hand, and he was marching towards us. Meeting time, meeting time. Now, I wasn't about to give up on my food at this point. This was not going to happen. So I neatly put the fork back into the styrofoam container, folded the container, and rose with purpose to take it along with me. And Kawauchi just suddenly stopped in his tracks. He was horrified. He said, "You taking food to business meeting?" And I said, "No, I'll just eat it in the cab." "Eat in cab?" He was even more horrified. And even the taxi driver was horrified when I brought a styrofoam container full of food into his taxi, and he and Kawauchi kept staring at me while I was greedily eating the food. And at the time, I couldn't understand what the big fuss was all about. And I said, "Kawauchi, don't worry, I'll trash it before we get into their office. Outside their office building, I'll trash it somewhere." Yeah. So we got to our destination, which was this very large intersection. It was the Otemachi intersection, I remember, which had 4 broad streets on all sides. And we got down, and I got down at the intersection and I looked for a trash can, and there were none. I looked up and down each of the 4 streets for any garbage bag outside a shop or a restaurant. Nothing. Now, Tokyo is so spotless that, any object on the street, be it a post box or a parking meter or a potted plant, can easily be distinguished from quite a distance. So when I say I didn't see a trash can, there was no doubt in my mind that there might have been one. It was very clear that there were absolutely none. And Kawauchi knew this well. And he was standing right next to me, his head cocked to one side, his eyes locked in on that object in my hand. And I said, forget it, we're going into a big bank building, there's got to be a trash can in the lobby. So I just marched past him and I went inside. Now, Japanese commercial banks, in keeping with their size, have colossal office buildings. And lobbies are these vast open spaces with either completely black or completely white walls, with nothing in between except a little tiny reception area in one end. So there's absolutely nothing between the entrance and the reception area. There's no chairs, no benches, no seating area, no shops, and there's no trash cans. So I walked in silence from the entrance all the way to the reception area, tightly gripping this empty white styrofoam container that now had some reddish stains on the outside. When we got to the reception, Kawauchi there were these 2 petite women in flowing yellow dresses at the reception, and Kawauchi spoke to them in Japanese. And at one point, he suddenly leaned forward and in hushed tones, he said something to them while looking occasionally at this object in my hand. Very embarrassed. And the women, for some reason, found this very funny. One of them started giggling. She said, "Gomi bako, yeah," which I took to mean that she did not have a trash can. So Kauchi was embarrassed. He took the 4 visitor badges from her and he gave mine to me with added hostility, I thought. And we went up to the 26th floor where our meeting was. And he tried his luck again with the local receptionist there. This time it worked. So this receptionist, who was also petite but wearing a flowing blue dress, she got up somberly, stepped out from where she was sitting, took the litter from my hands, came back and continued talking to Kauchi as if this never happened. She never made eye contact with me. She just continued. And I don't know whether she had a trash can under her desk or she was sacrificing her honor for our sake or what it was, but I didn't know. But I was very, very careful around Kauchi after that. I mean, I entered meeting rooms after the others. I only sat down in a seat as pointed out by him, and I only spoke when he told me it was my turn to speak. In fact, even despite a throbbing head, even when he cracked one of his silly, cheery comments, I would smile faintly. It was around 3 in the afternoon when we had another break and we were back at our offices, and my head was still throbbing, so I was at the water cooler and I was drinking as many glasses of ice cold water as I could. There were these little styrofoam glasses that were there, cups that were by the water cooler, and so I was drinking as many glasses of cold water as I could. And I suddenly turned and I saw Kevin next to me. And Kevin had suddenly transformed. He had this serene look and a very slight smile across his face. And I felt betrayed. I felt I'm still suffering. And how have you recovered from all this? And Kevin just said, "Ice cream. There's an ice cream vending machine on the other side of the floor. 1 cup of vanilla and it'll clear your head." So I got very excited. And I raced across through the elevator bank to the other side of the floor. And I put down my styrofoam drinking cup, looked for change in my pocket, had just about enough change, popped it into the vending machine, and out came this red and white Haagen-Dazs cup of vanilla ice cream. It was this big. It was icy cold, and there were these tiny water droplets that clung all around it. I just took it, and for a moment, I just held it against my face. This was the final solution to my suffering. I opened the cup, and I took in the creamy white layer of vanilla ice cream. Except there was no spoon inside. I looked around the vending machine and there was no spoons there. But I knew there were spoons by the desks where we were sitting at, so I decided to go back there. I recapped the Haagen-Dazs vanilla ice cream cup, picked up my styrofoam drinking cup and retraced my steps. As I entered the elevator bank, there was Kauchi standing with a wad of papers in his hand saying, "Chadda-san, we're looking for you, meeting time." And just then, the double doors on the other end opened, and Doug and Kevin walked in, and as luck would have it, an elevator door opened right in front of me, and before I knew it, I was in an elevator heading down to the lobby. I had in one hand a styrofoam cup half full of water. I had in the other hand an ice cream cup full of ice cream that had no spoon. There was no way of eating this ice cream, so I had to dispose of it somehow or watch it melt in my hands. Now, Kauchi hadn't seen the ice cream cup as yet, so what I did was, to avoid an early confrontation, is I drank the water and I took the ice cream cup and I put it into the styrofoam drinking cup. So, he probably wouldn't see that I had ice cream on me. Down in the lobby, I started scanning left and right as we were exiting the building. I was scanning left and right for any form of garbage disposal. I couldn't see any. I mean, Kauchi was racing ahead, I was trailing behind. I just thought I'd leave it somewhere. I even thought of placing it on the rim of this giant granite, pot that housed a gigantic plant. I thought I'd just leave it there and run, but the whole area was so squeaky clean that anyone would have noticed it. We were out on the street now, and a taxi was hailed. I was behind the others, but this time I raced ahead to sit in front so that no one could actually see what was inside my styrofoam drinking cup. I sat in the taxi and I examined the ice cream cup to see whether it had begun to melt or not. It hadn't begun to melt, but it wasn't as rock solid as earlier, so trouble wasn't far away. And I didn't know what to do. I just sat back in the taxi, I My legs swung out in front and then swung back out under the seat. And then a thought struck me, which I have to say I've never been proud of since, which is, what if I left the ice cream cup inside that styrofoam cup and left it under the seat? I mean, technically, even if the ice cream melted, it would melt into the styrofoam drinking cup, so it wouldn't really dirty the taxi unless it fell or something. I looked around the taxi and it was spotless. I mean, the Tokyo taxi drivers keep their taxis really clean, and it would be quite a terrible thing to litter in this manner. But I looked at the taxi driver, but he was focused on trying to overtake a bus to catch a red light ahead. So I quietly leaned forward and I placed the ice cream cup inside the styrofoam cup under my seat. And to be fair, I actually stayed in that position for a while, wondering whether I should reverse what I'd just done. But it's just that we approached our destination right then, and I looked out onto the street, and one look told me there were no trash cans, so the ice cream cup would have to stay. So I quietly got out of the cab, and I stood there, and I was watching Kawuchi pay the taxi driver in an exchange that seemed to me to be taking way too long. And Kevin was talking to me about the difference in quality of beef in McDonald's in various parts of the world. But I wasn't focused on that. I was just watching Kawuchi and the taxi driver in this exchange that seemed to be taking a long time. And finally Kawuchi turned and he approached us, and he smiled and said, "Let's go." So everything seemed fine, and I turned to follow him into the building. Just then the cabbie came running up behind me with a white cup in his hand and asked, "Yours?" Now, to deny it at this stage would have been, much worse and would have created quite a ruckus. So I said yes, and I quietly and I bravely took it back. Luckily, this was out of earshot of Kawuchi. But Kevin had seen this, and even he looked at me disapprovingly. I was quite ashamed of what I had done. I mean, this was Japan, the land of honor, and look how I had behaved. So I was determined to be very principled from this point on. I said, from now on, Kawuchi is not going to get embarrassed by seeing trash on me. It's not going to happen. So in true Harakiri style, I took the cup out of my right hand and I put it into my left pant pocket. I figured that even if the ice cream were to melt, it would melt inside the styrofoam drinking cup. So it may not stain my trousers. And even if some ice cream did come out and stain my trousers, if I placed it at a high end in my pocket and I pulled my jacket down, maybe no one would see anything for a while. Entered the building, and as we were going up in the elevator, I moved my hands in their newfound freedom, and Kawuchi smiled at me and I smiled back. We were on the 17th floor at the reception waiting for our meeting when I felt something shift inside my pocket. So I excused myself to go to the restroom to readjust the position of the cup in my pocket. And when I entered the restroom, there was another gentleman there, an elderly, respectable gentleman who was standing there at the counter, staring at himself in the mirror and gently combing his thin silver hair. So I didn't want to be embarrassed by, reveal the embarrassment of food on my person in front of someone else. So I just stood there. I thought I'll wait for him to leave, and I stood at the counter next to him. I also started looking at myself in the mirror and washing my hands. But this gentleman was taking his time. He was combing every strand very neatly, until finally he caught my eye in the mirror and almost apologetically turned to me, and he bent down in a deep bow. Now, I didn't know how that was going to affect but I didn't have much of a choice, so I clutched my pocket tightly and I reciprocated. And that's when I saw it. Right next to me, right beneath the counter, but partially obscured by a column, was a tiny steel bin. I only noticed it for that slight moment when my eye line dipped below the counter before bouncing back, but it was unmistakable. And so, as soon as I was back up, I quietly pulled the cup out of my pocket, looked the old man in the eye, and I bent down in a deep bow again. And as soon as I went below the counter line, I tossed the cup into the bin and stood back up. And this gentleman, who was obviously so touched by my seeming respect for Japanese traditions, looked at me and initiated a third bow, which I very happily reciprocated, because at this point in time, I had nothing but the greatest respect for Japanese traditions. Arigato.